Jim Jameson grew some of the biggest and most unique pumpkins you'd ever seen. You've probably noticed them online without knowing they were his. Every Halloween, when websites compete with one another to feature the spookiest content, you'd be hard-pressed not to see one of Jim's mammoth pumpkins carved into some kind of jack-o'-lantern. He was a local celebrity around here before he died, which was a pretty sad day for the whole town. The circumstances surrounding his death were well understood, but still bizarre and unfortunate. He'd been working on trying to grow bigger and bigger pumpkins for the shows and for his customers, and he'd been experimenting on the best ways to do it. The new method, which caused his death, was growing them in his greenhouse. Suspended in the air by a series of cables, the pumpkins could grow and grow without having the ground to retard their progress. The method resulted in enormous, beautifully symmetrical pumpkins. Then one day, as Jim was working in the greenhouse, a pumpkin the size of a small car fell from the ceiling when its cable snapped, broke every bone he had above his hips. The rescue workers who extricated him from the mess of blood and pumpkin guts famously said they'd never be able to carve a pumpkin again. Jim had no next of kin, so the property was sold off, along with everything on it. I was looking for a place in the area, and after a quick visit, I determined it was the best place for me. I moved in about a year ago. Moving into the home of someone who died, and seeing all their stuff sitting there, more or less undisturbed. Aside from the refrigerator being cleaned out and a few other maintenance-related things, was a strange experience. At first, it felt a little invasive going through Jim's belongings. There didn't appear to be anything too valuable. I figured whatever might have been there probably got taken by whoever cleaned the fridge. What I did find, though, were reams of paper and shelves of notebooks. Jim was a malicious note-taker. Every possible pumpkin permutation was cataloged, diagrammed, and explained in full. I learned about his cable system, his fertilizer combinations, and even his experimental work. The experiments fascinated me. Jim had seen pictures of fruits and vegetables that had been coaxed to grow into particular shapes. Square watermelons, star carrots, that kind of thing. But Jim's ambitions were greater than simple shapes. He wanted something unique and memorable, something that would put him on the map for more than just big pumpkins. One of the notebooks was filled with diagrams of a scarecrow-shaped mold in which a pumpkin could be grown. He detailed the various materials he'd need to use, the method of keeping the pumpkin properly watered, and even the various fertilizers he'd use at different stages of its growth. Apparently, he'd been working on this experiment since the late 1980s, but with little success. Molds were created and destroyed over the course of the years, with new materials being introduced or rejected depending on efficacy. Same with the irrigation methods. But fertilizer seemed to be the biggest problem for Jim. The plant wasn't getting the right amount of nourishment as it grew to fill the mold, leading to parts of it dying off and rotting for decades. He tried for decades, but failed. Whenever I had spare time, I read Jim's notebooks. I was fascinated by his experimenting and the trials and errors he went through. I found myself wondering if his works could be published someday. I couldn't imagine anyone being bored by the work he'd written about so passionately. Early last October, when the farm was turning brown and the leaves were turning red, I cracked open a notebook of Jim's from the year he died. I decided to skip a few because I was so anxious to learn if he'd had any success with his pumpkin experiment. At this point in his notes, he was writing about hybrid pumpkins. Pumpkin acorn, squash hybrids, pumpkin zucchini hybrids, all with the goal of solving the rot problem that had plagued his work. I flipped through the pages of the notebook, skimming the notes until one word stood out from all the others, as if it'd been written in red. Radiation. I turned back a few pages and was blown away by what I saw. Jim had, over time, purchased and disabled hundreds of smoke detectors. He was looking to collect the tiny amounts of americium-241 they had inside. With wide eyes, I pored over the pages as Jim talked about incorporating the aneurysm 241 into his fertilizer to induce mutations in the pumpkins. With each new entry, I saw that Jim began to have successes. He wrote about each complete, shaped pumpkin with unbridled enthusiasm. I started to notice a slight disconnect between the scientifically malicious Jim from before the success and potentially irradiated Jim after. I finished that notebook and started the next one. The disconnect continued. More hypotheses and about hydration and were detailed, including hybrids with ostriches and slugs and even dinosaurs. I groaned and dropped the notebook. The poor bastard had gone nuts. I felt pity for the old farmer, and part of me wondered if his death in the greenhouse was purposefully self-inflicted. If my mind was going, I might have done the same thing. I didn't read his notes for a couple of weeks. On Halloween, feeling bored and waiting for it to get dark so I could give the trick-or-treaters the full-size candy bars I'd bought to be the best neighbor ever, I picked up another one of Jim's notebooks. It was the last one he'd ever made entries in. The handwriting was terrible and the sentences were fragmented. Still, I could get a decent idea about what he was talking about. More nonsense about hybrids, more trials with the Americium 241 fertilizer. There were drawings, too. Not just diagrams, but artistically rendered representations of his pumpkins and the imaginary hybrids. Some were actually pretty cool, like one of a scarecrow pumpkin riding on an ostrich pumpkin. Silly, yes, but well drawn compared to his scrawled handwriting. The drawings tapered off as I got to the end of the notebook. On the last page, before a series of blanks, there was a diagram. I held it up and turned it around, trying to make out what it could be. Then it clicked. It was a map of the property. I saw the barn and the house and the greenhouse, but there was something there I didn't recognize. Something in the middle of the field by the 3 scarecrows that had been there for what looked like decades. Still bored and now curious, I brought the map with me to the field. Sure enough, at the center of the triangle formed by the scarecrows was a slight mound in the dirt. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I kicked the dust around for a minute and saw a rope connected to a wooden hatch. I pulled it open, revealing a passage and a ladder anchored into stone walls. I realized it had been a well at one point. I jogged back to the house and grabbed a flashlight. It was getting dark and I knew it'd be pitch black down there. I took care in climbing down the steps and reached the bottom after about 10 feet. Shallower than I thought, there was a narrow, low hallway with a dirt ceiling covered in the veiny stalactites of roots from the plants above. I stooped down and walked forward, brushing the roots out of my face and trying to put out of my mind the thought of spiders as their webs stuck to my face. My flashlight beam illuminated another wooden door with a rope handle. I reached out, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It was stuck. I aimed the flashlight around the door and noticed the metal rod sticking out of the wall, blocking the door from opening. I yanked the rod out of the wall and tried the door again. It opened easily. The flashlight showed a small room, about 5 feet by 5 feet. At first, I thought it was empty. But when I stepped inside, however, there was something against the wall next to the doorway. It took me a minute to figure out what it was in the dim light of the flashlight, but when I finally understood what I was looking at, I gasped. The thing began to move. I gave out a muffled scream as the creature the size of a man stood and stared at me. Its veiny, wished orange skin covered in dust, it moaned. I made a move to run, but the thing blocked my path. Now I did scream. I tried to strike it with my flashlight, but I was dealt with a heavy blow that sent me reeling. The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was the thing walking out the door and down the root-choked corridor. My blackout lasted the entire night. When I came to, I rolled around in pain and confusion. I was seeing double and was unbearably dizzy. I knew I had to have had a concussion, but for the first couple minutes I couldn't remember why. When it all came flooding back, a spell of panic pushed my dizziness aside, and I ran out the room, climbed out of the chamber, and hauled myself into the daylight. The farm was filled with police and emergency vehicles. One of the officers saw me staggering toward them and called out to his partner. He approached me just in time for me to collapse into their arms. I woke up in the hospital sometime later. I was indeed concussed, and my skull was home to a fracture that could have killed me. There was commotion outside the door, and I pressed the button near the bed to alert a nurse. When one finally came, she looked haggard and upset. I asked what was going on, dismayed by the slur I had heard in my speech. She sat on my bed and, without breaking eye contact, told me what had happened and why the hospital was full. I didn't believe her, so she turned on the local news, and the anchor was talking about the deaths in our town. The dead trick-or-treaters, the dead parents who tried to protect them, and the dead police officers who tried to intervene. The view changed to a charred and fractured area in the middle of the main street. It looked like a bomb had gone off. The nurse turned off the TV. The nurse said no one knew how any of it happened, and some people were even doubting what they'd seen less than 24 hours ago. It was too surreal. A man-shaped creature with skin like pumpkins screaming, "Where is my father?" while devastating any person it came near. But the evidence was there, especially in the victims. The dead were lucky. The living, though, were traumatized beyond comprehension. While I thought my injury was bad, as more details of the event were relayed, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived. Before she left to assist another patient, the nurse said one thing under her breath. It was quiet and almost sounded like she didn't want to say it, but felt compelled to. I didn't get all of it, but what I heard was enough. Shattered hips and jaws, and orifices stuffed with pumpkin seeds.